So the point of being here really is, in short, to provide context, to enable people to break beyond their echo chambers of where they work and get understanding of the priorities and the perspectives of other data users or data providers. And so we can get to a place of hopefully greater development in the shortest time frame possible. And it's good to, or hopefully good to, contextualize that in relation to the onward development of the TNFD framework. And the reason for that is if we created the framework and released it in September 2023 in isolation without looking at the data piece, I think that'd be quite naive. It's important to understand that we need to sort of walk a journey along that. Otherwise people say, well, the framework's great, but there's no data to populate that. And there is a narrative out there at the moment, which is quite widely held, that there is no data. How can we engage with that data? And there is data, albeit there are gaps and challenges, but it's a case of understanding those and engaging in a way that we can start walking and enabling development at the same time. So we created the data catalyst back in August to address the gaps and challenges that we identified back in the discussion paper we put out in March, I think it was. We've got 105 entities in there at the moment. These chaps, I think, in there at the moment, and there's a lot of other entities. And it's representative of the nature-related data landscape. Not everyone's there, obviously, but the idea being there's a collective virtual room where we can knock heads together, work in a collaborative way to try and address the issues that we have. So today, as I said already, Dan will facilitate this panel on this discussion, but it's key to say your input in this is just as important. Great panelists as they are, we want to hear your perspectives, okay? So halfway through, we will break out into small groups, so you'll have a chance so we can understand your perspectives and priorities, and then we will feed that back to the wider group at the end of the session. So bear that in mind, that halfway through, you'll be asked to contribute, and I invite you all to do that productively. Thanks, Dan.
All right, thank you very much, James. So as James said, my name is Dan O'Brien. I'm with PWC and also a member of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, and with James leading our data and analytics working group. And as James mentioned, the objective of these workshop sessions is to bring together use cases with some examples where data providers, different types of data platforms have provided examples of where their tools can be used to address particular challenges that have been faced by different industries. So this session today is energy and utilities. And I'm just financial services representatives? Excellent. Okay, good. So, I mean, we'll probably have a good sort of view of the value chain here from how companies that are operating in the sector are addressing risk, and then also perspectives from financial services in terms of how they would be using that information. And I believe we had one other person from Total. Are they here to speak? Stephen, right? Okay, nice. So Stephen, well, why don't you come up and we'll introduce you, and then yeah. All right. So while you're coming up, I'll allow each of you to introduce yourself. So Joshua, why don't you quickly tell everybody a bit about yourself and the organization that you're representing?
Thanks. So I'm Joshua Berger from CDC Biodiversité. Thanks for the invite. And at CDC Biodiversité, so we are based in Paris. We are working on biodiversity footprinting for economic activities and financial institutions. So I'm going to focus obviously on energy and utilities today. So yeah, should I?
Quick introduction and then we'll get.
Yeah. Okay. And so the main. So I'll talk about that later. But the main offering in terms of data that we provide is the Global Biodiversity Score tool, and also a database for financial institutions, the Biodiversity Impact Analytics provided by the Global Biodiversity Score.
Hi, everyone, and apologies for those who were in the session this morning and will have to hear my spiel once again. But I'm Ed Ellis. I'm the manager of the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, or IBAT. And so I represent the IBAT Alliance, which is a group of 4 leading conservation organizations. So we are a data provider, but coming more from the conservation charity side of things and making data that's been gathered and convened by the conservation community and making it available to the private sector.
Hello, everyone, and my name is Colmar Hjermsson, and I'm the CEO of Icelandic data and software company Svarmi. And we've basically been working a lot with different sectors, namely the energy and utility sector, on digitizing their environmental impact assessments before they build large infrastructure. And we were really happy when we learned about the TNFD because we saw a lack of integration of the level of detail they went into before building something, but after they built it and for ongoing operations, we saw less of an emphasis on the impact on nature and even less emphasis from the financial side of things. So we're quite excited to be here today, and we've been part of the TNFD forum to sort of align our solution further with this framework, and are actually piloting the framework now, starting this month.
Great, thank you, Colbert. And
so, yeah, sorry about the confusion. Stephen Dickinson, I'm the company biodiversity expert for Total Energies. I'm based in Paris in HQ, and I am involved in the TNFD piloting that we've conducted in-house. So, you know, this is part of the general trend around the nature-related frameworks, not just for reporting and disclosure, but SBTN and the nature positive, which is emerging very quickly. So we conducted an assessment by in two steps, essentially. A pilot where we compared our corporate operational framework against the TNFD. So we'll present you an overview of that, and then an alignment plan. So we can give you some highlights on those.
Yep. Excellent, thank you. And sorry, did you want to introduce yourself as well?
So Astrid Delaborde-Sprengers. So I'm a biodiversity engineer at Total Energies. I work closely with Stephen on all his biodiversity topics, and I will present you some key takeaways from the gap analysis and the alignment plan that we produced for you today. So
just quickly before we start, so going back to the objective of today's session and these particular workshops, as James mentioned, I think in order for TNFD to see large scale market adoption when the final version is released in September, it's critical that organizations across the value chain have access to appropriate data platforms and tools so that they can complete their assessments. I think if those tools are not available, or if there's a misunderstanding in terms of how they can be utilized, then we'll probably run into issues where there's going to be difficulties. So the objective of these sessions is to really bring together examples, use cases where users, and in this case, energy company Total, can talk about their experience using particular data platforms, and then hear also from the perspective of the data providers, the data platforms, and they can provide some specific examples of how they're addressing nature-related assessments for this sector. Once we've heard from them, then, as James said, we'll pause, and there'll probably be some questions and opportunity to discuss, but then we'll break out into a number of working groups and have a bit of a facilitated discussion internally as well. So Astrid, why don't you go ahead and start and provide us with an overview of your experience at Total.
Yes, thank you. So next slide, please. So as Stephen said, we started by doing a gap analysis. So we analyzed the reporting information that we currently disclose in our annual registration document, which is public information, of course. And we also analyzed like some internal documents that we have. And then, of course, so first conclusions from the gap analysis. Good news, we are quite well aligned already with the disclosure recommendations and with the LEAP approach in the TNFD. So, but we still analyzed some gaps. So among them, first we identified some easy wins, like let's say when we like look at the wording in our registration document, we talk a lot about environment, water, biodiversity, but we don't necessarily use the word nature. So the first thing to do is to make sure that in our reporting we take into account the definition, like all the components of nature that's defined in the TNFD. And so, yeah, so this is part of our alignment plan. So that's the first step, the quick win. And then, so we identified in the LEAP approach another gap, which is the lack of dependency assessment, proper dependency assessment. We tend to focus more on the impacts and risks that the company has, but not so much on dependencies and opportunities for now. And yeah, and among the challenges that we can identify right now is the fact that the TNFD framework is a moving target, so it's still under draft and under development. We are waiting for the next versions of the framework. So we have to adapt each time the TNFD framework updates. Let's say we have to align again. And also we have to make sure that the TNFD is aligned with other emerging nature frameworks, such as the GRI or the CSRD in Europe. And next slide, please. So this is just to show you what the gap analysis looks like. So really, we looked at every disclosure recommendation and put some color code to say that, well, when it's green, we are fully aligned with the recommendation already in our public report. So up, we can see public reporting. We have another slide after with the internal documentation. So that's just to show that we're even more aligned with the TNFD when we look at all of the documents that are available and not just the public information that we can find. So we are mostly either aligned or close to alignment to the TNFD disclosure recommendations. So next slide, we can just see that it's a bit better, a bit greener when we have more documentation. And yeah, next slide. So this is just for the LEAP approach. So we are, as I said, close to alignment, but yeah, we mostly identify the lack of dependency assessment and opportunities assessment. And yeah, so next slide 2. This is really like the global overview of the key takeaways from the gap analysis. And so yeah, so the things that I already talked about, making sure that the definition of nature is considered in our public reporting. Yeah, so we are the results are quite good, but we are now working on our alignment plan and implementing it, because we have a list of actions now thanks to this analysis. And yeah, we just have to keep working. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Astrid. I think a couple of things that strike me as it appears that you're able to leverage a lot of your existing internal risk assessment methodologies, probably around enterprise risk management and other existing environmental management frameworks that you have. Would you say that that's true?
Well, yeah, I think well, we have a lot of existing risk risk assessments and yeah, things that are already in place. I don't know if Stephen wants to.
In terms of today's theme, you wanted to also hone in on how we use the tools and global data sets.
Exactly, yeah.
So we see the biodiversity piece of TNFD as the key challenge, okay? But we're not starting from scratch. And when I say we, it's the industry. There's excellent products like IBAT out there. We use IBAT, but we also use the raw data sets that sit in IBAT and integrate them into our own tools. For a variety of reasons, for confidentiality restrictions that we have are very specific. They would maybe comply for others, but okay, we have our own rules. So, you know, the world databases on protected areas, the IUCN Red List data sets, the USGS World Tapestry maps, to give an indication of habitats, or IFC critical habitat data layers. We use these and to build our biodiversity registers for our operated and non-operated portfolios. So you're talking roughly 800 plus sites, plus another third for non-operated, 12,500 petrol stations across the world. And we're able to locate and link the potential overlap or proximity. And so that then, you know, ticks the box for the location in terms of sensitivity assessments. It's not new because the WEF indicator requires this as part of our reporting. So depending on whether you want to align, GRI has that also. So those are the ways that we use those tools to directly inform on those indicators, and you end up with number of sites, you know, within X whatever radius you've decided, or direct overlap, and then you're able to determine the surface area of your portfolio that is overlapping. So we have, I'd say, pretty basic tools, but that are able to deliver that kind of information. It also depends on, you know, the company's decisions to have its own GIS tools or to rely on external sources. But that kind of products and tools, you know, and data sets are hugely valuable. We'd be blind because we also use those same data sets to conduct our due diligence when we conduct screening assessments, when we do acquisitions, or we go into a greenfield area. So it's just being used for a different outcome, to provide the reporting and disclosure. So I think generally, depending, especially the extractive sector has maybe that advantage because we've worked with those tools and data sets for a long time to inform our own risk assessments. That puts us in, I'd say, a fairly comfortable position. Yeah.
Well, that's great. So why don't we switch gears a bit, and maybe we can hear about Colmar, your company's experience and some of the work that you're doing in Iceland.
Yeah, so I didn't mention it before, but the source, when I say data, I feel like often when we say data, it applies to a very wide area of different things. But for us, data is maps and very high resolution, up to very high resolution 3D representations or digital versions of site level operations. And that's basically where we come from. So we've been using Earth observation, drones, satellites, but also combining it with ground observations and trying to, as I mentioned, digitize a process that was already existing. And I really agree with what was said in terms of the making the processes already in place support the emerging disclosures, so that you're not reinventing the wheel and that you're only doing a top-down analysis, but that you're also able to really do a very precise site-level aggregation of data up to the company level. So that's basically where we come from, and we've been working with, as I mentioned, the energy sector, but also mining and just recently the beverage sector, where we see that our approach to taking stock or inventory of nature really applies across sectors, but when it goes into the deep conversion into risks and opportunities, then it's becoming more sector specific, and it's usually based on knowledge that we don't have as an entity, but it's actually our clients. So that's sort of our journey to this, and for us, simplicity is key. So we spent a lot of time, and we have a lot of smart people working on making these things more simple, because that's also what we believe is going to be key to being able to incorporate all of the different small suppliers and all of the really getting the full scope of scope 3 nature impact as well.
That's excellent. I'm curious to know if you've also experienced some of the same challenges that Astrid and Stephen had mentioned around the challenge when it comes to looking at dependencies, for example, dependencies on ecosystem services, or looking at the opportunity side as well.
Yeah, I mean, the main challenge we have seen would relate to the how well different pieces of information speak to one another. So basically, we have a data set, or we have a report saying that this is what's happening here, but usually it's difficult to make this speak to what this means for the business, and that's what I think really this framework provides a lot of guidance in sort of pulling companies and their service providers, data providers through this process, because I feel up until now it's been difficult for us to actually become experts in the fields of our clients and actually be able to convert what we find to be insights into something that's business relevant for them. So I think this is critical to, of course, there's no one size fits all, but I do feel that this is adding a lot of clarity into the journey on how to get to these dependencies.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because there needs to be some interpretation or assessment of the data and how it relates back to the organization. And it's not always the role of the data provider to provide that analysis. That would be, often the company or the consultants that they're working with. So good. Ed, did you want to tell us a little bit more about your experience with IBAT and how it's being applied with the utilities and energy sector?
Sure, thanks. So first, to put a little bit more context around what IBAT is, IBAT's been around for quite some time now and has been used by the extractives, by the energy sector for just as long. We were first established in 2006, so we're one of the oldest conservation decision support tools. And it was really this recognition of the IBAT Alliance partners who have been collecting and collating and sitting on biodiversity data for, in some cases, decades, and realizing this would be really, really valuable for the private sector to be able to access and use to inform decisions. And so really out of that genesis, IBAT was born. And IBAT's a web-based mapping and reporting tool that's really designed to provide fast, easy, and integrated access to critical biodiversity information to help inform decisions on the ground for the private sector. And reflecting on the difference between this session and the one we had this morning with the financial services, there's a huge advantage for the energy and utility operators, because they have been working with this data for so long. They have experience with understanding sort of what biodiversity is, how it should be managed, how biodiversity data can be used appropriately, what the limitations of those data sets are. Whereas I think the finance community writ large, this is a gross generalization, but I think they're perhaps earlier in their biodiversity journey. And so a lot more of the conversations around that sort of education piece. What we're seeing though is that, historically, a lot of what IBAT has been used for is very much on sort of the location-specific risk identification and avoidance and management. And this is really what IBAT was set up to do originally. It's really around screening for biodiversity-related risk and being able to do it at a desktop-based level. Which is then informed by, more on-the-ground site-based assessments and bringing in that local data to complement the global data sets that IBAT's able to provide. Where I think the challenges and the opportunities start to emerge is looking at not just the identification of risk, but the identification of opportunity as well. And so something like the species threat abatement and restoration metric, or STAR, is still in its relatively early stage, but it's really designed to catalyze action around where are the opportunities for managing biodiversity related risk, and how can we start to work that into the framework. So not just thinking about risk and not just thinking about impact, but also where are the opportunities. But of course, the other really important point is dependency data. And particularly ecosystems. And this is something where IBAT is not well set up to manage at this stage. And there are other tools out there that are really good at explaining sort of what dependencies are. Encore springs to mind, which is exploring natural capital risks, opportunities. And this is really around helping to highlight where there are dependencies on nature, on ecosystem services. Where I see the real advantage for TNFD is to provide sort of harmonization across this tool landscape and helping to point people in the direction of tools that are fit for specific purposes, and providing sort of a complementary lens around when you should use what tools, what the limitations might be. And if you're interested in sort of dependencies, here are some appropriate metrics and targets. When you're thinking about impacts, these are the sorts of things that you could take into account.
That's great. Thank you, Ed. And so CDC Biodiversity is a biodiversity footprinting tool, which is kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, something that would be used for looking at a portfolio of assets. And could you tell us a little bit more about the platform and how it might be used by the financial services sector to perhaps evaluate their portfolio and look at how an energy and utility company is performing relative to peers?
I have some slides, but waiting for the slides. So maybe just to clarify, CDC Biodiversity is developing two types of tools and databases. So it's not actually mainly and primarily for financial institutions. It's for companies to assess the biodiversity footprint. And so we've been working with energy utilities a lot actually recently. For instance, we've conducted an assessment with Vattenfall, a Swedish company, an energy utility. They've talked about the assessment recently before the COP, and we've worked with other energy utilities in Germany and Finland, in France also, and we've worked with a number of other companies outside the energy and utility industry, because the Global Biodiversity Score tool, the GBS, is a sector agnostic kind of tool which can adapt to a number of industries. So of course we do have some limitations. For instance, for fisheries, it's not really a relevant tool because marine biodiversity is not well covered, and offshore industry also for energy is not well covered for the same reason. Yeah, so I'll come back to the experience with energy utilities later. And outside CDC Biodiversity, we also have a number of consultancies who have been trained to use the tool, and they've worked with some energy company, especially in the oil and gas sector. So I'll come back to that later, but maybe first to give you an overview of how does the GBS relate to the TNFD framework, and then a focus on the locate and evaluate steps. So this is the steps of the TNFD. And so for the locate step, the GBS does locate activities and impacts if the data allow to do it. So if the energy company or the utility company has data on where its sites are located, where the land occupation occurs, where the water consumption occurs, where greenhouse gas emissions are emitted. For the greenhouse gas emissions, it's less important, but for the other topics, it is very important. Then we do take that into account. For the evaluate step, so we do cover, so the challenge mentioned by Stephen and Astrid of dependencies. Initially, the GBS was really focusing on impacts, but we have integrated data from Encore, the database just mentioned, that actually everyone is using at this point. We have integrated that to develop dependency scores, and so we do also cover dependencies. And then, of course, we cover impacts. That's the main focus of the tool, of the GBS. And then, so it's not the main focus of the GBS, but through dependencies, we assess physical risks. And through impacts, we assess, we evaluate transition risks. And especially we think that the metric that we use, the mean species abundance, which focuses on ecosystems. So it does not cover everything. It does not cover species extinction. It does not cover genes. So you have to use tools and data layers, like for instance, STAR, which is in IBAT, for species extinction on top of the GBS. But it is already a very good proxy of transition risk. And we think, for instance, that you can use a kind of shadow price for ecosystem integrity of about 5 million euro per square kilometer MSA. And that can give you an idea of the transition risk if you look at a company turnover or financial institutions financing a company. They can use that shadow price to assess whether a business is exposed to transition risk in a way that is risky. And so for the prepare, we do also partially cover that. To go a bit more in detail on the locate step, so the interface nature step, we are currently updating a layer at 300 meter resolution based on satellite imaging from the European Space Agency, which will, so it's not that good. We don't have a picture yet. So I used the one from Encore. but it's going to be quite similar. So that's the biodiversity depletion layer from Encore. So we are going to have a grid of mean species abundance value globally at 300 meter, 300 meter, which could be used to interface nature and say, I have a site there, what's the mean species abundance, and use that as a screening, a bit like for IBAT. Then you would have to ground truth that with site-specific data, but that could help for the locate step. And then, so as I said, so sorry, the slide had some issues transferring from my computer to the TNFD data lab computer, but so that's data input file from the GBS, that's an Excel file. And within it, you've got the location asked. So if the energy utility, for instance, has location-specific data, it inputs that, and then we track that in the GBS. We can use, we've done case studies and pilots using location-specific data on the state of biodiversity. So this is very difficult to do and very costly, but it is possible. And we've done one proof of concept of using bird ecological survey data to then calculate the mean species abundance and the impact. And so this is a flowchart of the organization of a company, fictitious company. We report the results by business unit, basically. And so here you've got the data from each site coming back and then being aggregated. So what we usually report in the GBS is the end result at the company level, but we do have the data which are not necessarily reported by the company at the site level if they reported them at the site level. And finally, for the overview on this evaluate step. So as I said, we do have data from Encore, which we translate into dependency scores from 0 to 100% by ecosystem services. So we've got 21 ecosystem services, and then we report that by business unit or different levels of reporting that I just mentioned. So that's for dependencies. And for impact, so the GBS covers most of the IP best pressures. So you've got the list here. And for terrestrial and freshwater realms, so we do have gaps, especially for marine biodiversity and invasive alien species. Due to science gaps in the science, we don't have yet the pressure impact relationship to cover that. And of course, as soon as we get the science, then we want to include that also. And yeah, so the mean species abundance, we are happy that it's included in the TNFD framework as an exposure metric. And yeah, so one last word on location, and one of the challenges we've faced with energy utilities. They are not, I think, as advanced as energy, oil and gas mining companies in terms of biodiversity and location. And so we've seen many times that they don't have the land occupation around their sites, for instance, for hydropower plants, for dams. They don't know exactly what they own actually around the dam, and what other stakeholders in the relevant kind of area of influence would stakeholders are, and what is the land use, which is an issue when you try to assess the biodiversity footprint. And just one more thought, it's I think Stephen and Astrid talked a lot about actually direct operations, so scope 1 impacts. But I think if we want to address biodiversity loss, especially for energy utilities, you've got a huge impact in the fuel being used, like biomass, natural gas, etc. And so you do have to take into account upstream impacts, scope 3 impacts. And so that's one of the things that the tool like the GBS does.
That's great. Sorry, just to clarify, you're saying it does look at upstream impacts. Yeah. Well, I think this is a theme that we've heard over and over again is this requirement or need for good spatial location information of both direct operational activities and assets, but also of those in the value chain, both upstream and downstream. I'm curious to know, Stephen, is that something that you had a chance to look at? Were you looking at your direct operations, or did you delve into upstream or downstream activities?
So for sure, in terms of the framework and what we covered, it includes the upstream too. It's also fair to say that historically, our industries, especially the extractives, have been focused heavily on our operational impacts because they were deemed material, more material. So in all honesty, we're still catching up on the supply chain, but what we do in our company, we have a 5-step process for supply chain. First, we conduct a complete risk assessment using French standards to actually conduct the risk assessment that includes several attributes: climate, water, forests, and biodiversity. And we screen our 100,000 suppliers. So that allows us to hone in on the material ones and then work on them at several levels. We now impose a UNESCO World Heritage Site no-go, like we have for our own operational impacts, on our suppliers in terms of retaining the current ones and selecting the future ones. We also require that when they're in IUCN protected areas, they have a biodiversity action plan. So this is based on a declaration process. So we have to couple that with an auditing system. Of course, you can't audit 100,000. So you sample and you then conduct site visits and audits on them. We also do the buyers. Our buyers are trained for biodiversity, as well as some of our suppliers, the ones that are the most material, to bring them up we'll raise the bar, I'd say. And we also have that built into our contracts, our PPF contracts. And that essentially is where we're at right now. The trick with suppliers, there's two things. There's which rank they're at. And so your material risk may not necessarily be on your first rank suppliers. They be hidden up, along the supply chain. That's challenging. And then actually knowing the actual geographic location where the activity leading to the product that you're eventually purchasing is conducted. So you can imagine how tentacular that is. So we're still grasping and working out how to deal with that. But because it's a locate approach, unless you're able to know where those locations are, then it becomes a massive challenge. So there's alternative ways, and the GBS is a great tool for that, because it can work using financial data. I mean, Joshua could talk better. So we've looked at that too. I think, it seems like the TNFD, but also the CSRD and IFRAG, and I'm thinking of the SRS4 is going to be demanding, more focus on that. So I think gradually over time, the balance will be found as to what is a realistic ask. And it could be variable according to the size of companies also, and it could be a stepwise approach that we have to get, because if not, you're going to leave a lot of people on the side of the road, and that gap will increase, and we will have failed with the ultimate goal, which is to help protect nature or make contributions towards that.
That's excellent. Maybe I'll turn it now to the group here and see if there's any questions that people have here for our panelists. Come on, they gotta be. Here we are, over here. Yeah, I'll get the mic to you.
Hi, Isabel, IBM. Energy sectors, they work with biodiversity for a long time. They need to report for law or regulations and also to monitor everything. I want to ask you guys, what do you think the TNFD will change on the process that they already have? What is the main new topic for us? Thank you.
So from our perspective, for us at least, I think the scope is expanded, to focus more on the dependencies and the opportunities. So that's actually adding value to the reporting and will benefit nature ultimately. I think, it's also providing a more level playing field. But if you're based in Europe, you're already under pretty strict requirements for reporting and disclosure, like I was pointing out. So I was hoping that the TNFD would lead to a removal of all the other ESG questionnaires and like CDP, everything would go and we'd have a one-stop shop. That's clearly not going to be the case. So the issue is reporting where also. I think on the other side, more transparency. Yes, of course we want to do that, but we have to find that balance, and whether people like it or not, eventually that will be the case, because if you're not getting the level of response that you're expecting, because there's new questionnaires all the time coming in, eventually, things will settle in maybe a less favorable position than the trajectory we were hoping to be on by introducing TNFD. So I know TNFD was going to, it's like the natural capital protocol. You know, there's a toolbox that they could refer to, and it's important to use the existing to avoid reinventing the wheel, but also to take always, as when you can, an optimal approach to avoid duplication, and bear in mind the level of effort that is required. I mean, we could spend our lives soon just doing ESG reporting, and you know, that's steering you away from your operational impact management and working on your supply chain, your downstream aspects. So and you don't want just the leader type companies that have maybe the capacity to meet that increase. You know, what about all the people who are not in the room? And this is where 99% of, you know, the impacts are happening. So that's really important, and we have to work in a very collegial, clever way to make sure that doesn't happen, and that you can raise the bar, because it's society at large that needs to work at improving our nature-related footprints. Yeah.
I will add that the TNFD, I guess to Astrid's earlier point, also one of the sort of principles is integration with other reporting frameworks. You'll see the similarity to how the TCFD is structured. You know, there's aim and object, like one of the objectives is to not replace or create something new, but to provide something that will integrate in. So good. I think just you in the back there. Pass the mic over.
Thank you. And maybe it's a basic question, but I'm well aware of the use of carbon shadow prices. But Joshua, I heard the term about ecosystem integrity shadow price. Just wanted to understand better. I know the concept of ecosystem integrity, but just the use of shadow pricing, how's it being used by the markets? Thank you.
Yeah, so I wondered whether I should mention that, because it's still early stage and it's not directly used by the market right now, but internally at CDC Biodiversity, that's a concept we use, and we've been discussing with some central banks, for instance, and some people in the research teams at the central bank, they are interested in that kind of thinking. And for instance, the NGFS, Network for Greening the Financial Sector, they are working on scenarios, on stress tests, and they are looking at ways to integrate biodiversity risk. And that's a very rough and crude measure, but a simple shadow price, as I said, 5 million euros per square kilometer MSA is a good starting point. So it's not enough, but it's interesting to start. And we are conducting, for instance, so I think to come back to the first question, another thing that TNFD might change is it provides a common language for finance and the oil and gas, energy, utility, and all the other industries. And so it should also, I think, speed up the adoption by industries and financial industry, which are not as advanced maybe as the oil and gas in terms of scope 1 assessments. And so we are conducting a stress test for a bank in France, and we might use the shadow price concept to assess the transition risk, for instance. And so if they are funding oil and gas or utility companies, that they are going to see, does that affect the turnover or the enterprise value of the business?
That's good. I think we had another question right here first.
Thank you. Carolyn Callahan, Canadian Wildlife Federation. So we partner with energy companies to restore habitat for pollinators in particular. I think Stephen's words were really wise about trying to raise the bar for everyone. But then the scientist brain in me says, yes, but as Joshua said, collecting data on species like birds is very time intensive, very expensive. And so I'm looking for a place somewhere in the middle, and that's how do we optimize that? So, you know, even if we take bird data, birds aren't representing all of biodiversity. So, you know, biodiversity is very complex, it's difficult. You cannot have direct measures of everything, but somewhere in the middle, I'm not sure, maybe is the sweet spot. And you know, maybe you have some comment on that, if I was clear.
Maybe I can start. So in the GBS, we try to find that sweet spot, and what we have an approach, a kind of stepwise approach where we try to use the base data available for each step. And so I mentioned the bird data, but actually, as I said, that's not what we use, and we actually use that only on one pilot or a couple of pilots. Because that's too time consuming, and it's, as you said, it's also not comprehensive enough to look at all biodiversity. So the type of data we use usually is what we call pressure data, or what we call inventory data, using more or less life cycle assessment vocabulary. And that's, for instance, the land occupation by land use type. So distinguishing, for instance, between natural forest, reduced impact logging, clear cut harvesting, if we talk about forests. And then we use water withdrawn and consumed, greenhouse gas emissions, pollutant emissions like pesticides or other chemical molecules which have detrimental effects on biodiversity. And we use tonnages of communities, so tonnages of natural gas, wood, crops, etc. And so we think that's the sweet spot for many cases, because that allows to do a screening. And sometimes it's like if you have land use, for instance, and data on hydrological disturbance due to dams, for instance, then you could do a pretty good assessment of the biodiversity impact. And then if you want to go further, you would need to do ground truthing with actual data, including potentially eDNA. That's something we are looking at, but it doesn't solve everything. And so if you that's the best. If you don't have that, you can still use financial data, but then you are going to work on sectoral averages. So it's not as good, but yeah, sometimes you have to use that.
Ed, did you want to add to that in terms of, and I think, you know, from what I've seen, there's the opportunity to really identify and prioritize where there may be higher or lower risk areas that might require further ground sampling and more intensive analysis, as opposed to using you know, the footprinting metrics and the footprinting tools. Do you have some experience or examples that you could point to where IBAT's been used in that context?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the question, because there does need to be a sweet spot, and the amount of time and effort and energy, as Stephen was saying, that you could put into just meeting sort of disclosure requirements is taking time and energy away from actually taking action on the ground, which is at the end of the day what this is really trying to catalyze, right? It is trying to get better outcomes for nature on the ground. And this is where I think the prioritization piece is really important, in that there's a lot that you can do with globally available data sets to identify where you should be expending additional time and effort and resources to go on the ground, do that sampling. And so this is partly where IBAT comes in as a early stage, high level risk screening tool. And so we have the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. All birds worldwide have been comprehensively assessed. So we have really good data on where birds are likely to be found, the threats that they face, the pressures that they face, the sorts of habitats that they're likely to be found in. And what IBAT is really set up to do is help companies walk through that prioritization process and look across your portfolio of sites and understand, I've got 100 sites, I have the budget, the time, the resources to really dive deep on 10. Which of those 10 should they be? Where am I going to potentially be exposed to the most risk? Where do I have the highest concentrations of threatened species? Where am I potentially overlapping with protected areas, whether it's category 1 and 2 IUCN, whether it's UNESCO World Heritage sites? Where am I in proximity to Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, the last remaining refuges for certain species? And then once you've got that prioritization list, that's where you start to make that shift from global desktop-based screening, which can be done really rapidly and really easily, to that on the ground, in the field, engaging people with local knowledge. And I think one missing component from this process and this panel at the moment is the voice of local communities and Indigenous communities and people who are, you know, in many places, the custodians and stewards of nature. And there's a really important role for them to play with bringing their local knowledge, their contextual knowledge, their cultural knowledge to bear on some of these sorts of problems. And that's a process I think we should all be engaging with.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it also comes into play when you're looking to assess the state of an ecosystem in terms of either a reference site in terms of what you're managing towards, or the current state, and to determine, you know, if there's degradation there. I think that local knowledge is really critical for that. you had a question, and then I think we're going to switch over into the breakout sessions. But
thank you. Melissa Pokordian, Capital Asset Management. First, thank you for the panelists. It's been very informative, and thank you for Total for shedding light on how the Total Energies, to shed light on how the framework can be used. And we've been talking a lot about how it can be used as a reporting framework, and I think that's the main intention of the TNFD. And I'm wondering if you can speak on how can this have an impact on decision making or change the way decisions are going to be made, especially when it comes to the trade-off between financial opportunity and negative impact on biodiversity.
I mean, certainly the fact that you're talking about new criteria, like the opportunities and dependencies will lead to certain levels of change, and to have a more complete and holistic approach. That's clear. We saw that with other questionnaires like the CDP water, helped us consolidate our business case to improve certain aspects of how we were managing water, for example. So this will have, I think, also similar repercussions. But again, the big challenge is the biodiversity piece, and CDC is offering an early solution. We've tended to focus on seeking inspiration with other methods, like the WCMC has developed a biodiversity indicators for site-based impact approach. Its target was to allow aggregation, which is what these kind of frameworks want to tap into, and it's a bottom-up approach. So we've sought inspiration from those kind of methods and developed our own, and it includes dual indicators. One for habitats, which is based on ecosystem extent and condition, and the other one for species. We use the STAR metric, which is it's imperfect, but it's a proxy, and allows you to have inter-site aggregation and end up with a near similar target as to the CO2 for biodiversity equivalent, or for the cubic meter for water equivalent for biodiversity. But that's still work in progress. There's efforts, but it's much closer, at least for operational impact assessment, to what we feel comfortable with, that science-based approach, but remaining pragmatic. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but it shows that there's still a huge amount of work. The nature positive framework that the IUCN is working on has those kind of metrics. The ESRS4 is looking for those kind of metrics too, and indicators. But you need to have a consolidated set of indicators to which you can choose then specific metrics. But we need maybe half a dozen, something like that, and they're possibly different whether you're looking at your operational impacts, your scope 1, or your supply chain impacts. As Joshua pointed out, the GBS is bringing that dimension. So it may be that we have to agree in the short to medium term to use a set of indicators for site-based impacts for operations and another indicator for your supply chain. Ideally, we'd have one indicator that we could aggregate. Yeah.
Go ahead, Joshua.
I think the disclosure is really necessary, but it's only a first step. And if you look at the Global Biodiversity Framework, Target 15 says currently that we need to reduce impact by half for companies and increase positive impacts, half negative impacts and increase positive impacts. The SBTN is going to come up with some trajectories, targets for companies, etc. We need to have the disclosure to see if we are on track for the minus 50%. But I think the next step that the TNFD is going to allow is to set targets and then starting to act and disclose on the progress, etc. The metrics like the mean species abundance, they are in the CBD framework. Currently it's a complementary indicator. It's not a headline indicator, but it's there. It's in the TNFD. It's indirectly in the CSRD ESRS E4 draft through the Align project. And there are other metrics like STAR, for instance, which have similar recognition. And so I think what then we can have also policy tools like we have for climate For instance, we've got nationally determined contributions indices for climate. We could have the same thing for biodiversity with metrics like mean species abundance, STAR, and others, and see how countries progress towards the achievement of the nature positive world and how companies contribute to that. We could also have financial tools. Like I'm not saying we should say that I'm very cautious, but like, for instance, biodiversity credits, that kind of things. So I think that's the next step after disclosure.
And maybe as we shift into the breakout groups, this might be an interesting area of discussion that we could hear input from some of our financial services colleagues here about how these metrics, these disclosure metrics, might be interpreted within their risk assessment frameworks in terms of making decisions about capital allocation, right? Good. Well, this has been fantastic, and I very much appreciate and thank you all for sharing your experiences and talking more about your tools and your assessment experiences.